The morning of January 13th, 1887, the temperature in Chase County, Nebraska, stood at 41 degrees below zero. Dorothea Wren stood outside in that cold, 66 years old, 5 feet 3 inches, a woman the county had already written off as dead. Behind her, a dome built from tumbleweeds and chicken wire rose against a sky the color of old bone. The storm had tried to take it. 2 days of wind that sounded like a freight train running off its rails. 2 days of cold that froze exposed skin in under 4 minutes. 2 days that had killed 11 people across the county, men with proper houses, men with timber walls and full wood stores, and decades of Nebraska winters behind them. The dome was still standing. Dorothea breathed out. A white plume rose and vanished into the frozen air. She could hear Halvar Bjork's voice in her memory, clear as the day he had said it 5 months earlier, standing outside the ruins of someone else's abandoned claim. You'll freeze. And that boy will freeze with you. She looked at the dome. She breathed again. They were still here. Go back 5 months. Go back to August when the grass ran waist high and the sky was the kind of blue that made you forget what this land could become. Go back to the morning Silas Pruitt gave Dorothea Wren a gift. Silas Pruitt was not a cruel man by the measure of cruelty that most people recognized. He did not shout. He did not strike. He kept his boots clean and his voice reasonable. And when he did something that would have looked monstrous from a certain angle, he always found a way to arrange the light so the angle was never quite right. Dorothea had worked for him for 2 years. After her husband Elias died and the farm debt came due and the bank took everything that could be taken, she had come to Pruitt's household the way water comes to low ground because there was nowhere else to go. She cooked his meals. She kept his accounts. She managed his household with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to everything in her life, from 30 years of nursing in county hospitals across 3 states to raising her son Thomas after Elias's first illness left him bedridden for 2 seasons running. Thomas was gone now. Fever 3 winters back. He had left behind a wife who lasted 1 more year before consumption took her too, and a boy named Callum who was 8 years old and had learned in the particular way that children learn things they cannot name, that the world was not arranged with his survival in mind. Dorothea had taken Callum. There had been no discussion about it. She had simply taken him, packed what little remained of Thomas's household into a single trunk, and arrived at Pruitt's door with the boy beside her and a look on her face that foreclosed any argument Pruitt might have considered making. Pruitt had said nothing. He had let them both stay. And for 2 years that had seemed like the arrangement they all understood. Then in late July of 1886, Pruitt's second wife arrived. Her name was Lucinda. She was 34 years old, prettier than the land deserved, and she came with opinions about how a household should run and who should be running it. Within 2 weeks, the arrangement that everyone had understood quietly ceased to be understood. Pruitt came to Dorothea on a Tuesday morning in August while Callum was out gathering eggs, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and fresh cornbread. He sat down across from her at the table, folded his hands, and spoke in the reasonable voice he used for all transactions. He had found a solution, he had said. A good one. A generous one. He wanted her to understand that. There was a quarter section of land 12 miles south of Imperial, Nebraska. A family named Hendricks had filed on it 3 years back and quit last spring when the well went dry and the roof of their dugout caved, and the husband decided that California was a more reasonable proposition than another Nebraska winter. The claim was abandoned. The title was clear. Pruitt had spoken to the land office. As a head of household with a dependent, he nodded toward the window. Toward where Callum was somewhere among the chickens. Dorothea had every legal right to file on that quarter section. He set a folded piece of paper on the table between them. The deed of transfer. Already signed on his end. All it needed was her mark. He said it was the least he could do. He said he believed in her. He said she was one of the most capable women he had ever known, and that a woman of her capability deserved something of her own rather than working in another person's house. He said all of this in the reasonable voice with the folded hands while the coffee cooled between them. Dorothea looked at the paper. She had been a nurse for 30 years. She had sat across from patients who were telling her things that weren't true because the truth was too frightening or too shameful or too complicated to say plainly. She had learned to hear what was underneath the words, the thing the voice was trying to cover. She heard it now. She did not say what she heard. She picked up the paper, folded it once more, and placed it in her apron pocket. She asked Pruitt one question. How much was the filing fee? Pruitt paused. Just a fraction of a second. Just long enough. $14, he said. Standard homestead fee. Dorothea had 43 cents in a cloth purse at the back of the flour bin. She had not told Pruitt this. She did not tell him now. She thanked him. She called Callum inside. She packed their 2 bags in under 20 minutes. Everything they owned fit easily, which was itself a kind of statement about what 2 years of honest work in another person's house had produced. Pruitt's hired man drove them south in the buckboard. He didn't look at them when he dropped them off. He set their bags in the dirt, turned the wagon, and was back over the horizon before the dust settled. Dorothea stood in the August heat and looked at what the Hendricks family had left behind. The dugout had been carved into a low rise in the earth, 3 walls of packed sod, and one of cut bricks with a roof that had caved in entirely on the eastern side. The door hung from a single leather hinge. Inside, she found a cast-iron stove, too heavy for anyone to haul away, 3 lengths of rusted stovepipe, the remains of a broken chair, and a pile of rotted sacking that had once been someone's hope for a flower store. On the interior wall, someone had scratched words into the dried clay. God help whoever comes next. Dorothea read it. She did not say anything about it. She turned around and walked back outside where Callum was standing with his bag at his feet, looking at the broken windmill, the way 8-year-olds look at things they don't understand but are trying to make sense of through sheer concentration. She put her hand on his shoulder. She walked the quarter section that afternoon while he sat in the shade of the windmill frame. The grass ran high, moved by a wind that never stopped. She found the well-roped rotted bucket, gone the shaft dry as chalk, when she dropped a stone down and heard nothing for a long time. She found the outline of where a kitchen garden had been choked now, with volunteer sunflowers and lamb's quarters and a tangle of something that might have been turnip, gone wild. She found the tumbleweed. They had piled against the eastern fence line in drifts taller than her head. Dried Russian thistle, brown and skeletal, the branching stems interlocked into masses so dense they looked like haystacks from 20 feet away. She had seen them her entire adult life in Nebraska, seen farmers curse them, burn them, watch them clog wells and collapse fences, and spread their seeds across every plowed field in the territory. She stopped in front of the largest pile. She pushed her hand into the mass through the thorns. They pricked her palm, through the worn fabric of her glove, and into the interior. The wind stopped. The wind, not the wind itself, the wind was still moving through the grass behind her, still pressing against her back. But inside the mass of interlocked stems there was nothing. Dead air, still and dry and completely separate from the world outside. She held her hand there for a moment. She did not have a thought yet. Just a sensation, something about the quality of that stillness. The way it felt different from shade or shadow. The way it felt like absence itself, like the wind had simply forgotten this space existed. She pulled her hand out. The thorns caught at her glove. She walked back to Callum. "Grandma, what do we do?" She looked at the ruins of the dugout. She looked at the pile of weeds. She looked at the 40 miles of flat sky in every direction. "We look at what we have." 3 days later, Halvard Bjork rode up on a plow horse. He was 68 years old, built like a man who had been arguing with the weather his entire life and had never quite won, but had never quite lost either. His beard was iron gray and trimmed short, and he had the eyes of someone who had learned to read the sky and trust what he read. He had homesteaded in Nebraska since 1879. He had survived blizzards that buried fence posts to their tops. He had lost a son and a daughter-in-law to illness in the winter of 1882 and had gone on working the next morning because the cattle still needed feeding. He rode up to the dugout, dismounted without being invited, and walked the perimeter the way a man walks the perimeter of a battlefield after the fighting is done. He looked at the caved roof. He looked at the stove Dorothea had dragged into the open air so she could cook without breathing the dust that sifted down from the collapsed sod. He looked at Callum, who was stacking dried cow chips into careful pyramids beside the windmill base, organizing the world the way children organize things they cannot control. Then he looked at Dorothea. "Pruitt told me you were here," he said you'd be dead by November. Pruitt says a lot of things. He's not wrong about November. He was a man who spoke in plain facts the way other men spoke in pleasantries. He told her about 1880, the first hard winter he had survived in Nebraska. Snow in October that didn't stop until May. His household eating seed grain by February. Two families on neighboring claims who had burned their furniture. Then their fencing, then their barn walls, and still hadn't made it to spring. A woman alone, he said, cannot cut enough timber. And there isn't timber to cut on this stretch of plains anyway. Not a grove within 15 miles that would yield enough for a winter. A woman alone with a child, he shook his head. The arithmetic didn't work. Dorothea listened to all of it. When he finished, she asked the one question that mattered. If I come to work for you, Callum stays with me. Halvard was a man who didn't perform. He didn't reach for a comfortable face or a reassuring answer. He just paused, and in that pause, Dorothea heard everything Pruitt had arranged. Callum would be housed in Halvard's home as a household helper. Dorothea would cook and manage. They would be under the same roof technically, but they would not be together in the way that mattered, the way where she was his grandmother and he was her grandson, and neither of them was anyone's servant. She understood it in the length of one breath. Thank you, she said. We'll manage here. Halvard looked at her the way a man looks at an equation that comes out wrong, no matter how he runs the numbers. You're 66 years old, he said. No tools, no team, no fuel stores, no food beyond what that boy can gather. You have, 8 weeks before the first hard freeze. Something like that. I've seen what happens when people don't prepare. I've watched it end in ways you don't want to imagine. He mounted his horse. He looked at Callum, then back at her. That boy didn't choose this situation. Don't let your pride make the choice for him. He rode east. The grass swallowed him up, and then there was only the sound of wind and the distant creak of the broken windmill. Callum came to stand beside her. Are we going to be okay, Grandma? She looked east where Halvard had disappeared. She looked west, where the sun was dropping toward the flat line of the horizon and painting the grass in colors that had nothing to do with the cold that was coming. She didn't lie to him, but she didn't collapse the future into what she could see from here either. I don't know yet, she said, but I'm going to find out. The idea came in the hour before dawn, 3 nights after Halvard rode away. Dorothea couldn't sleep. She lay in the ruined dugout. They had rigged a canvas over the collapsed section of roof, using cords she had unraveled from the rotted sacking enough to keep the dew off, and listened to the sounds of the August night. Coyotes somewhere to the north, the endless movement of the grass, and beneath that the sound she had been hearing every night without really listening to it, the dry rattle of tumbleweed shifting against the fence line stem, catching on stem, the thorny architecture of one plant interlocking with another. She lay still and listened to it. In her 30 years of nursing, she had worked in hospitals that ranged from well-built stone structures in county seats to single-room wooden buildings on the edge of settlement territories, where winter came through the gaps in the planking like a living thing. She had learned in those years something that the medical texts stated plainly, but that most people failed to grasp in its full practical implication. Heat did not simply disappear. Heat moved. It transferred from warm things to cold things, and the engine of that transfer outdoors and in buildings was air. Moving air. Air that carried warmth away from surfaces the way a river carries silt constantly and visibly and without mercy. Stop the air from moving and you stop the loss. That was why a patient in a sealed room retained body heat better than a patient in a drafty one, even without additional fire. That was why hay bales didn't freeze solid at their centers, even in deep winter. That was why the interior of that tumbleweed pile had felt against her palm like a different world entirely from the one outside it. She sat up in the darkness. The tumbleweed did not insulate because it was warm. It insulated because it was a maze, an almost impenetrable tangle of stems and branches that trapped air in 1,000 small pockets and held it still. Dead air, motionless air, air that could not carry heat away because it had no place to go. A sod house worked because the earth was thick and dense and slow to conduct temperature change. But sod was heavy. Each brick weighed 50 pounds. She had watched Callum try to lift one of the deteriorated bricks from the old wall, and he had barely shifted it. She was 66 years old. Her hands worked, her mind worked, but she was not going to cut and haul 1,000 bricks before the first freeze, and anyone who told her otherwise was selling something. A tumbleweed weighed less than 10 pounds. She could carry them. She could compress them. She could pack them so tightly between frames of wire that the air inside could not move at all. She knew it was an absurd idea. She had enough experience with the world to know exactly how absurd it was. Tumbleweed was the most reviled plant on the Nebraska plains. Farmers lost weeks of labor dealing with them every year, pulling them from fences, clearing them from wells, watching them carry their 100,000 seeds across every field they had broken. Nobody used them for anything. Nobody had ever used them for anything, but she had thousands of them piled against her fence line, and they had cost her nothing. And she had 43 cents, and the filing fee was $14, and winter was 8 weeks away. She lay back down. She looked at the strip of stars visible through the gap in the canvas roof. She did the math one more time, the same math she had been doing every night since Pruitt's hired man had dropped their bags in the dirt and turned the wagon around. The math still didn't work. The numbers were still impossible. But she had one thing she hadn't had before she lay down: a direction. She went to Rowena Slade the next morning. Rowena's place was 3 miles to the southwest. A claim she had kept going alone since her husband Marcus died the previous winter of a fever that started as a cough. She was 47 years old, broad-shouldered, and matter-of-fact, with a way of looking at a situation that stripped away everything decorative and got to the structural question fast. She kept chickens, sold eggs to the general store in Imperial, minded her own affairs with a precision that the other settlers had learned to respect as its own form of communication. Dorothea walked to her homestead with Callum. She knocked. She went inside when Rowena opened the door, sat down at the offered chair, and explained what she intended to build. Rowena listened without interrupting. When Dorothea finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Tumbleweed is a fire trap," she said. "One ember from that stove, and the whole structure goes in 30 seconds. Compressed material doesn't burn the same way as loose material," Dorothea said. "There's no air circulation inside the packed mass. Without air movement, you can't sustain combustion. The fire goes out at the surface." Rowena looked at her. "You're talking about building a house out of the worst weed on the plains. I'm talking about building shelter from what I have. It won't work. It might not. It probably won't. Probably not." Dorothea agreed. Rowena stood up. She disappeared into the back of her house. She came back with an armload of wire, hexagonal chicken wire, the kind used for poultry enclosures, in pieces of varying sizes left over from a co-op expansion she had abandoned after Marcus died. "It's not enough for what you're describing," Rowena said, "but it's something." Dorothea looked at her. "I'm not helping because I think this will work," Rowena said. "I'm helping because I remember my first winter here, and I remember what it felt like to need something and have nobody come." She set the wire on the table between them. "I still think you're going to freeze." "That's all right," Dorothea said. "People have thought that before." She picked up the wire. She and Callum walked home with it. The morning was bright and already hot, the kind of August morning that made Nebraska's coming winter feel like a story someone made up to frighten children. She set the wire down beside the tumbleweed pile. She looked at her hands, 66 years of living, written in every line of them, the knuckles enlarged from arthritis that stiffened every morning until 9 o'clock, the calluses from 30 years of medical work and a lifetime of practical labor. The particular set of the fingers that came from knowing how to do things carefully in situations where careless was not an option. She was not going to build this with strength. She had learned over 6 decades that strength was the first resource to go and the least reliable to plan around. What she had was something harder to name and harder to take away. She knew how things worked. She knew why they failed. She had spent 30 years understanding bodies, the systems that kept them alive, the conditions that killed them, the point at which warmth became the difference between function and death. She knew how heat moved. She knew how to stop it. She picked up the first tumbleweed from the pile, feeling the thorns catch against her palms. The mass of it, lighter than anything with so much presence, had a right to be. She began. The filing fee was $14. She had 43 cents. She had a pile of weeds that everyone said was worthless, a child who needed to live through January, and a dome-shaped idea that no one in the history of the Nebraska territory had ever tried before. She had the cold coming down from the north like something patient and inevitable. The same cold that had already taken names she knew that would take more names before April came. And she had 66 years of understanding that the only arithmetic that mattered in the end was not how much you had. It was what you did with it. She pressed the first tumbleweed into the wire frame. It held. She pressed the second one in beside it, compressing the branching stems until the two masses interlocked the air inside them, trapped and still. Outside, the August wind moved through the grass in long waves, indifferent and permanent. Inside the forming wall, nothing moved. Nothing at all. The first thing Dorothea Wren built was not the dome. It was a routine. Without a routine, the work would have killed her before the cold had a chance to try. She understood this the way she understood most things, not from theory, but from watching what happened to people who didn't account for their own limitations. She had seen it in hospitals in the patients who pushed too hard too fast after surgery and tore open what had been carefully closed. She had seen it in homesteaders who worked themselves into the ground in September, trying to do in one season what required two, and arrived at January with nothing left. She was 66 years old. She woke every morning with hands that would not fully close until she had worked them open slowly, finger by finger, over the course of an hour. Her right shoulder had carried a grinding ache since a bad fall 3 winters back that had never quite resolved. Her knees told her about the weather before the sky did. She could not build like a young woman. So she built like herself. She rose before dawn. She heated water on the cast iron stove she had wrestled back inside the dugout, drank it slowly, and moved her hands around the warmth of the cup until the joints loosened enough to be useful. She ate whatever there was cornmeal mush most mornings. Sometimes the wild turnips she and Callum dug from the abandoned garden plot once a rabbit Callum managed to catch in a snare. She showed him how to construct from salvaged wire. She worked from 9 in the morning until the light began to fail. Not because she didn't want to work longer, but because past a certain point, tired hands made errors that rested. Hands had to spend twice as long correcting. She had learned this at 22, working her first winter hospital rotation when the senior physician had sent her home at the end of an 18-hour shift and told her that exhaustion was not the same as dedication and that a nurse who could not see straight was more dangerous than no nurse at all. She had carried that lesson for 44 years. Callum worked beside her. He was 8 years old and serious in the way children become serious when they understand at some level they cannot articulate that the situation around them does not have room for something less than full attention. She did not pretend the work was anything other than what it was. She did not make it into a game or soften its edges with false cheerfulness. She explained what she was doing and why, and she gave him tasks that matched what an 8-year-old's hands and body could actually accomplish. He held the wire frame steady while she worked the tumbleweeds into position. He carried the smaller pieces of salvaged material she couldn't manage and work at the same time. He counted she needed him to count, to track the spacing between the willow poles, to tell her when the angle of the emerging dome was drifting from the line she had set. In this way they built. The frame was the problem that came first. She needed flexible poles long enough to arc from ground to peak, strong enough to hold shape under the eventual weight of packed tumbleweeds, and available within a distance she could actually travel. There was no timber on this stretch of plains. The nearest stand of cottonwood grew along the Republican River 8 miles south. Willow grew there, too green and supple, exactly what she needed. 8 miles. She looked at the distance on the mental map she had built of this territory in her first weeks of walking it. 8 miles south, 8 miles back, carrying as much as she could manage on her shoulders. She left Callum with strict instructions: stay close to the dugout. Keep the water bucket filled from the rain barrel. Do not approach the broken windmill shaft and walk south before dawn. She cut willow branches with the pocket knife she kept on her person, because 30 years of practical work had taught her that a person without a cutting tool was a person who would eventually need a cutting tool at the worst possible moment. She cut them green as long as she could manage, bundled them with cords salvaged from the rotted sacking, and walked back with the bundle across her shoulders. The weight was manageable. The distance was not irrelevant. By the time she reached the claim again, her shoulder was speaking to her in ways she did not appreciate, and she sat down for 20 minutes before she did anything else, not because she wanted to, but because she had learned long ago that the body's accounting was exact and debts taken out against it accrued interest. She made the walk twice. The second time she brought Callum, who could carry a smaller bundle, and they came back in the afternoon with enough willow to begin. She drove the poles into the ground around the perimeter of the excavated dugout floor. She had spent 4 days digging the floor down another 18 inches, a calculation based on the principle that below-ground temperature was stable regardless of surface conditions, and stable meant survivable. Each pole went in 2 feet deep, positioned at 2-foot intervals around an oval roughly 14 feet long and 10 feet wide. Then she bent them inward. This was the moment she had been less certain about in theory, and the moment that turned out to require more refinement than she had anticipated. Green willow bent without breaking, but it had its own ideas about the arc it wanted to follow, and the arc it wanted was not always the arc she needed. She worked each pair of poles slowly bending, adjusting, lashing the tops together with strips of rawhide that would shrink as they dried and tighten the joint without being told. The first 3 attempts produced a frame that leaned noticeably to the northeast. She studied it, identified the problem. 2 poles on the western side had gone into the ground at a slight outward angle and corrected them. The 4th attempt produced something that was not perfect, but was sound, a series of overlapping arches rising to a peak 8 feet above the excavated floor. She stood back and looked at it. It looked like a skeleton, like the rib cage of some enormous animal that had come to rest here in the grass and slowly become part of the landscape. Callum stood beside her, looking at it with the concentrated attention he brought to everything she built. "Will it hold the weeds?" he asked. "That's what we're going to find out." The chicken wire came next, and the chicken wire required money she did not have. Rowena's scrap pieces were enough for perhaps a quarter of the outer layer she needed. 4 full rolls would do it, right enough for inner and outer surfaces, with the tumbleweed packed between, creating a shell 12 inches thick around the entire dome. 4 rolls at 50 cents each in Imperial's general store. $2 she did not have against the 43 cents in her cloth purse. She thought about this for one evening. One evening was all she allowed herself for problems with known solutions. The solution was labor. She walked to Imperial, 12 miles north on a road that was mostly the suggestion of a road 2 tracks worn into the grass by wagon wheels running more or less straight toward the cluster of buildings that constituted the new county seat. She arrived in the early afternoon, went directly to Hannigan's general store, and presented herself to the owner, a compact man named Orrin Hannigan, who had come from Ohio 6 years back and had survived by being the kind of businessman who could read a situation faster than most people could describe it. She told him what she needed. She told him what she had. She told him what she was willing to do in exchange. Hannigan looked at her for a moment. He looked at the way she was standing straight, direct, not performing either desperation or confidence, simply presenting the facts of a transaction and waiting for his response. He gave her 2 rolls in exchange for 1 week's labor. Sweeping inventory, hauling freight from the supply wagons that came up from the railroad terminus at Culbertson to the south. She worked the week. Her hands, already damaged from the tumbleweed thorns and the willow cutting, developed new complaints from the freight work. She wrapped them each morning with strips of cloth and kept going. Callum stayed with the Bjorks during that week. Halvard said nothing about this arrangement, but he did not turn the boy away. Astrid Bjork fed him at the family table and taught him 2 words of Norwegian that Callum carried back to Dorothea like small treasures. When the week ended, Dorothea walked back to the claim with 2 rolls of chicken wire across her shoulders, her cloth purse slightly heavier, with 3 additional cents Hannigan had added without explanation. She did not thank him for the extra cents. She thanked him for the wire and the work, which was the honest transaction, and let the extra cents speak for themselves. She began packing the tumbleweeds on the 1st of September. The work was unlike anything she had done before, and she had done a great deal. Each tumbleweed had to be worked into position by hand. The branching architecture of the plant meant it couldn't simply be stuffed into a space. It had to be fed in from a specific angle, rotated until its internal structure interlocked with its neighbors, and then compressed. The compression was everything. Loosely packed tumbleweeds were exactly what Rowena had said they were: a fire hazard, a light and airy mass of dry material that would catch and carry flame in seconds. Tightly packed tumbleweeds were something different, something she was increasingly certain about with each layer she completed. She wore fabric wrapped around her palms to protect against the thorns, but the thorns found gaps. By the end of the first day, her hands were marked with a constellation of small punctures, each one a precise red point. By the end of the first week, the punctures had scabbed and split and scabbed again so many times that she had stopped feeling them individually. They had become part of the texture of the work, the way cold became part of the texture of winter, not ignored but incorporated. The dome grew in layers. First, the outer wire surface stapled to the willow poles with nail bent into U-shapes, a technique she developed after 3 failed attempts with straight nails that pulled loose under the pressure of the wire's natural spring. Then the tumbleweeds worked in from the bottom up. Then the inner wire layer erected a foot inside the outer surface, creating the shell she needed. 12 inches of packed plant material. 1,000 small air pockets, each one sealed by the compressed stems around it. each one a tiny barrier against the cold that was coming. The dome grew darker as the layers thickened. Light that had filtered easily through the wire and sparse early layers now found itself stopped at the surface turned back. Inside the dome in the afternoons, it was dim and quiet and still. She pressed her palm against the packed wall one evening when the September sun was still warm enough to make the work pleasant. On the outside of the wall, she could feel the heat of the day stored in the surface layer of tumbleweeds. On the inside of the wall, pressed against the inner wire from within, she felt almost nothing. A faint coolness, the temperature of the air that the layers had captured and held. Dead air, still and quiet and going nowhere. She stood there for a moment with her palms against both surfaces and felt the difference between them 12 inches apart. Yes, she said to no one in particular. Yes, that's it. Silas Pruitt came back on the 14th of September. He rode up in the late afternoon with two men she recognized from Hannigan's Storeland speculators who had been working the county all summer, buying quit claims on abandoned homesteads and reselling them to the steady stream of late arrivals who came looking for land that someone else had already proved was farmable. Pruitt dismounted and walked around the half-finished dome without touching anything. He had the careful assessing look of a man performing a calculation he has already run and is now checking for errors he doesn't expect to find. Well, he said after a full circuit, this is something, it's shelter, it's a pile of weeds on a wire frame. He looked at the dome with an expression that was not quite contempt. It was something more careful than contempt, something that kept contempt in reserve as a tool while deploying something more useful. You know what happens when this catches fire? A single ember. One spark from that stovepipe on a dry night. Compressed material doesn't sustain combustion the same way loose material does, she said. There's no air circulation in a packed mass. The fire goes out at the surface. You've been reading. I've been thinking. Same problem. He smiled, and it was the reasonable smile, the one that had been in the room the morning he gave her the deed transfer, and the morning he told her the filing fee was $14, and both times she had heard what was underneath it. Books don't tell you what 40 below feels like from the inside. Books don't tell you what it sounds like when someone freezes to death. Callum was inside the dome arranging the bedding they had made from prairie grass stuffed into grain sacks. Dorothea moved slightly so that Pruitt's line of sight to the entrance was interrupted. What do you want, Mr. Pruitt? He nodded toward the two men behind him. They wanted to buy the quarter section. $12 for her quitclaim, more than fair for land she hadn't yet proved. She could take the money, buy passage on the freight wagon to Culberson, take the train somewhere with a reasonable winner. She asked what would happen to Callum. Pruitt's answer came a half-second too smooth, too prepared. The boy could come back to his household. He was young enough to be placed with another family through the proper channels. The Children's Aid Society had agents in Culberson who handled these things regularly. Dorothea looked at him. She had spent 2 years in his household, watching how he moved through the world. She had cooked his meals and kept his accounts and been present in the background of enough conversations to understand the architecture of how he thought. And now, standing in front of the half-finished dome she had built from a plant that everyone agreed was worthless, she understood something she had only half perceived before. Pruitt had never particularly wanted the land. The land was incidental. Land was everywhere in Nebraska in 1886, more land than there were people to want it, more abandoned claims than the land office could track. What Pruitt wanted was Callum, an 8-year-old boy, healthy and obedient and trained already to useful work with no parents and no one to ask complicated questions about his welfare. A boy who could be placed and replaced and moved through the system of informal labor that the territory ran on, and who would generate value for whoever held his papers for years to come. The land was the mechanism. She was the obstacle. No, she said. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. The reasonable face held its shape. He remounted. The filing fee is $14, Mrs. Wren. You have 43 cents. Winter comes in October and sometimes September. When you're ready to be sensible, you know where to find me. He rode away with the speculators. She watched until they were over the horizon. Then she sat down in the grass in front of the dome, put her hands on her knees and looked at the ground between her feet. $14.43. She sat there for 5 minutes, not collapsing, not panicking, simply allowing the full weight of the arithmetic to register without flinching from it, because flinching changed nothing and clear sight changed everything. Then she stood up. She went back to packing tumbleweeds. October arrived with frost on the ground before sunrise and a bite in the afternoon wind that had not been there in September. The dome was nearly complete, walls finished, the peak sealed with a thick mud mixture she made from clay, dug near the dry well, reinforced with twisted prairie grass, pressed into the surface while it was still wet. The stovepipe collar she had engineered from salvaged tin and packed clay held the pipe steady and sealed the joint where it passed through the dome's apex. She had banked additional tumbleweeds around the base of the exterior, 3 feet thick, where the walls met the ground. That junction where the insulated surface met the earth was where she expected the cold to try hardest to get in. She pressed her palm against the exterior wall, cold surface already storing the chill of the October nights. She pressed her palm against the interior wall, cool, not cold, the temperature of still air captured weeks ago, held in place by the compressed mass between. The dome was working, and then Callum began to cough. It started small, the kind of cough that comes with dry air and dusty bedding, the kind she had heard 100 times in the early weeks of a hospital autumn season. She noted it, she watched it. By the third day it had deepened. By the fifth day she put her hand to his forehead and felt what she had been afraid she would feel. The specific warmth that was not the warmth of exertion or of proximity to the stove. The warmth that meant the body had redirected all its resources toward fighting something. Fever. She had treated fever for 30 years. She knew its stages and its rhythms, knew when it was a body doing its necessary work, and when it had crossed into territory that required intervention she could not provide here. She checked his breathing. She checked his pulse, 2 fingers on the inside of his wrist, counting against the rhythm in her own chest. She watched the color of his lips and the clarity of his eyes when he was awake, and the quality of his sleep when he wasn't. She burned fuel she could not afford to burn, keeping the interior of the dome warm enough that his body could focus its energy on the infection rather than on maintaining its own temperature. She boiled water and made him breathe the steam. She had dried chamomile from the abandoned garden enough for several days of tea. She used it carefully, measuring by feel. She did not sleep, not for 3 days. On the second night she sat beside him in the lamp light. She had one small oil lamp rationed to 3 hours per night and looked at the child who was the last direct connection she had to her son, and she thought for the first and only time in this story about stopping. Not because she was afraid for herself. She had made her peace with her own mortality in increments over 66 years the way most people did. What she felt was the specific fear of someone who has taken responsibility for another life and is watching that responsibility exceed the reach of what they can provide. The fear that her decision to refuse Halvard's offer, to refuse Prudet's offer to stay on this piece of ground and try this impossible thing, had used Callum as its currency without his consent. She sat with that fear. She did not argue with it. She did not push it away. She let it complete itself, and then she went on watching his breathing, because that was what she could actually do. And doing what you could actually do was the only response to fear that had ever in her experience produced any result worth having. On the morning of the fourth day, Callum opened his eyes. He looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a child coming back from somewhere difficult. "Grandma, I'm hungry." She made cornmeal mush with the last spoonful of the honey she had kept back from a wild hive she and Callum had found in early September, a small treasure that she had rationed with the precision she gave to every resource that could not be replenished. She watched him eat half of it and fall back into sleep. Real sleep this time, the deep and steady sleep of a body that has finished its hardest work. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed it and was not ashamed of it. The body had its own accounting, and the debt of 3 sleepless nights was being presented for payment. She set down the bowl. She pressed the back of her wrist against his forehead. Cooler, damp, with clean sweat. She let out a breath that took a long time to finish. Rowena Slade came on a morning in mid-October when the frost on the ground didn't melt until nearly noon. She came through the dome's entrance, a low willow frame covered with a doubled blanket, weighted at the base with stones, and stood in the interior with the particular stillness of someone recalibrating what they expected to find. The dome was finished. The walls complete. The floor excavated 18 inches below grade, the earth itself providing the stable, slow temperature change foundation she had built everything else upon. The stove sat centered in the space, its pipe rising cleanly through the collar at the peak. Rowena pressed her palm against the interior wall. She held it there. "It's warm," she said. Warmer than outside, Dorothea said. Significantly warmer once the stove has been lit for an hour. I told Halvard you were going to build a fire trap. Rowena turned slowly, looking at the sealed ceiling, the packed walls, the mud-sealed joints. He agreed with me. She reached into her coat. She brought out a folded piece of paper. She held it out. Dorothea unfolded it. It was a homestead claim, filed at the land office in Imperial, stamped and registered. Her name, Dorothea Wren, on the line designated for the head of household. Rowena Slade's name on the line designated for guarantor. The fee line showed $14 paid. Dorothea looked at the paper for a long time without speaking. Pruitt came to see me, Rowena said. Her voice was level, carrying information, the way practical women carry information plainly without decoration. Came to my place 3 days after he came here. Told me I'd be throwing my money away. Told me you'd be dead before Christmas and I'd never see a cent of it back. She paused. He also offered me money to tell you to stop. To tell you the dome was too dangerous and you should take his offer and go. The paper was rough in Dorothea's hands. The ink was official and dark. I told him no, Rowena said. Not because I think this dome is going to hold through January. I still have serious doubts about that. She looked at the walls, then back at Dorothea. But nobody gets to decide when you're done except you. Not Pruitt, not Halvard, not me. She paused again. Not the cold if it can possibly be helped. Callum, who had been listening from his bedding in the corner, made a small sound, half laugh, half something that didn't have a name, but belonged to the category of sounds a child makes when an adult says something that realigns the world slightly. Rowena looked at him. You're looking better than I expected, she told him. I was sick, he said. Grandma fixed it. Did she? She always does. Rowena looked at Dorothea. Something shifted in her expression, not sentiment exactly, something more durable than sentiment. You still might freeze, she said. That's all right, Dorothea said. People keep telling me that. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her apron pocket, next to where the original deed transfer had lived since the morning Pruitt had laid it on the table between them. That paper had been a trap. This one was the opposite of a trap. She pressed her hand flat against it, feeling the shape of it through the fabric. Outside, the October wind was picking up, carrying the first real edge of what was coming, not the cold itself yet, but the cold's announcement, the way the land changed its quality of light and air in the weeks before the killing temperature arrived. Inside the dome, the air did not move. It held still and warm and waiting. She had 43 cents and a homestead claim and walls made of what everyone agreed was the most worthless plant on the Nebraska plains. January was coming. November passed the way hard things pass, not quickly, not mercifully, but completely. Day after day, the temperature dropped in increments that felt almost polite until they didn't. The thermometer at Halvard Bjork's farm registered 8 degrees above zero on the 3rd of November, then 4, then -12 on the morning of the 22nd. The ground froze to a depth that made digging impossible. The Republican River slowed and thickened and went silent under a skin of ice that grew thicker each week. The grass that had run waist-high in August was flattened now, pressed into the earth by the weight of cold that sat on the land like something with intention. Inside the dome, the temperature never fell below 31 degrees. Dorothea had not been certain it would hold. She had been as certain as the physics allowed, which was to say certain about the principle and uncertain about the execution, about whether 12 inches of packed tumbleweed was 12 inches of packed tumbleweed in the way she needed it to be, or whether there were gaps she hadn't sealed, thin spots. She hadn't caught places where the cold would find its way through the maze of stems and branches and the dead air she had trapped there. She lit the stove twice daily, 1 hour in the morning to cook and bring the interior to 50 degrees, enough warmth to work and move without injury. 1 hour in the evening to cook again and heat water that she used for washing for the clay. She continued to press into any cracks she found in the mud, seals for the tea she made from the dried chamomile, and wild rose hips she had gathered before the frost covered everything. Between fires, the dome held its temperature through the insulation alone. She and Callum slept in all their clothing, layered together under the blanket and the quilt she had sewn from grain sacks stuffed with prairie grass. Their breath fogged in the air. The water bucket grew a skin of ice by midnight, but they did not freeze. They did not come close to freezing. She had spent November testing the dome the way she had spent 30 years testing treatments, observing, adjusting, recording in her memory the data that the walls produced each night when the fire went out and the cold pressed in and the insulation either held or it didn't. It held. Every morning she pressed her palms against the interior wall and felt the temperature differential across 12 inches of compressed plant material. And every morning the differential was there, significant, measurable, the difference between a body that could maintain its own warmth and a body that couldn't. She was running low on fuel. The rationing had been careful, more careful than she had thought she could manage in the early weeks when the dome was still proving itself, and the temptation to burn more for the comfort of warmth she could feel was strong. She had resisted it. She had kept to the schedule, the 2 hours per day, and the fuel had lasted longer than she had calculated. By the end of November, she still had 30 bushels of twisted hay and cow chips, enough for another month, perhaps 6 weeks if the schedule held. January was the question. January was always the question in Nebraska. Halvard Björk came to see the dome in the first week of December. He rode up on the same plow horse in the gray midday light of a December afternoon and dismounted with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints had opinions about cold weather. He stood outside the dome for a moment, looking at its exterior, the battered tumbleweeds visible at the surface of the outer wire layer, frost-dusted and wind-worn but intact, the mudseals darkened with weather but uncracked in any significant way. Then he ducked through the entrance. He stood inside for a long time without speaking. The stove was cold morning fire, long out evening fire, not yet started. The interior temperature, Dorothea estimated, was somewhere around 34 degrees. Outside, it was 6 above zero. Halvard pressed his palm against the interior wall. He held it there. He moved his hand to a different section of the wall. He held it there too. Then he looked at her. "It's working," he said. "Yes. I didn't think it would. I know." He turned slowly in the small space, looking at the construction with the eyes of a man who had built things himself and understood what it took to build them. He looked at the mud seals. He looked at the stovepipe collar. He looked at the excavated floor 18 inches below, grayed the earth walls rising around the living space. "The worst hasn't come yet," he said. "January and February are different from November. The cold goes deeper. The storms last longer. The fuel runs out faster because you can't gather more when you're pinned inside for days at a stretch. I know, but this..." He paused. The word he was looking for was not a comfortable one for a man who had stated clearly 4 months earlier that she and the boy would freeze. This might hold. It might actually hold. He ducked back outside. She followed him. He stood beside his horse in the December light, and he looked at her with the expression of a man revising an equation he had been certain of. "I have hay I can spare," he said. "Winter stores. The cattle need most of it, but there's surplus I won't use before spring." He looked at the sky, reading something in it she couldn't parse. "If you can haul it yourself, you can have what's left over. 2 wagon loads, maybe slightly more." She looked at him. He did not frame it as generosity. He did not soften it or make it into something other than what it was: a practical man making a practical decision based on revised data. "I'll come tomorrow," she said. He nodded, once mounted, and rode east. She watched him go. Then she went inside and started the evening fire, and the warmth that spread through the dome in the following hour felt like something more than warmth, like the accumulation of 4 months of work arriving at a moment that confirmed it had not been wasted. She would take the hay. She would haul it herself. 3 trips with the makeshift sled she had built from salvaged boards and a length of rope. Her shoulders doing the work her 43 cents could not buy. She would add it to the fuel store and recalculate. January was still the question. But the math was getting better. The first December blizzard came on the 23rd. She saw it building from the northwest in the early morning, a darkness along the horizon that moved with the particular speed of something that had been gathering itself for a long time. By noon, the wind had risen from the usual steady push to something with velocity and intent. By 2 in the afternoon, she could not see the broken windmill 50 feet from the dome's entrance. She sealed everything. The entrance blanket weighted with stones, the gaps around the stovepipe stuffed with twisted grass. The additional tumbleweeds she had kept stacked along the exterior's north face banked higher, adding mass and insulation on the side that would take the most direct assault. The storm lasted 2 days. Inside the dome, the wind was a sound rather than a force present, continuous, transformed by the 12 inches of packed material between them, and it into something muffled and distant. the way a storm sounds from inside a barn or from deep in a stone building. The walls flexed slightly under the pressure, the chicken wire moving against the willow poles in a rhythm that was unsettling the first time it happened and ordinary by the third hour. The dome breathed with the storm, yielding slightly and recovering the way something well-built yields to force rather than opposing it rigidly and breaking. The interior temperature dropped to 22 degrees on the first night. She lit the stove and brought it back to 35. When the fire died, it settled at 28. Outside, the thermometer at the Bjork farm would later show -8. On the second night of the storm, Dorothea heard something at the entrance. At first, she thought it was the wind finding a new angle, a new way to press against the dome's exterior and produce a sound she hadn't cataloged yet. She lay still and listened. Callum was asleep beside her, his breathing slow and even. The sound came again. Not wind, something irregular, something with the rhythm of intention rather than weather. She rose. She pulled on her coat and boots. She slept in her coat, now had since October, and moved to the entrance. She shifted the weighted blanket aside. Astrid Bjork fell through the opening. She came in on her knees, one hand braced against the willow frame, her coat torn at the shoulder. Her face white in a way that had nothing to do with cold, and everything to do with what cold does to exposed skin when it has been working on it long enough. Her hands, when Dorothea caught her by the shoulders and steadied her, were rigid, the fingers stiff and unyielding, the color wrong. Frostbite. Both hands, possibly both feet. Dorothea pulled her fully inside and sealed the entrance behind her. She lit the stove, immediately burning fuel she had not planned to burn, feeding it steadily until the dome's interior climbed back toward 40 degrees. She had learned at 32 years old, in her second winter of nursing, in a county where frostbite was a regular presentation, that the treatment of frozen tissue required warmth that arrived gradually, not the instinct of rubbing, which damaged the returning circulation, but immersion in water that was warm and getting warmer by degrees. She did not have a basin large enough. She used the cook pot. Filled with snow, she packed in from outside and held near the stove until it liquefied and warmed. She placed Astrid's hands in the water. She watched the color change, the specific progression from white to deep red. That meant circulation returning, which hurt considerably more than the numbness that preceded it. Astrid sat with her hands in the warming water and said nothing for a long time. Callum had woken. He sat across the stove from Astrid, watching her with the serious attention he brought to everything that mattered. Halvard went to check the cattle, Astrid finally said. Her voice was flat. Not emotionless, something flatter than emotion, the register a person reaches when the thing that has happened is too large for the ordinary architecture of feeling to contain. He went out 3 hours before I came here. The storm had started, but it wasn't like this yet. He said he would be back in 20 minutes. She looked at her hands in the water. I waited. I waited past the time when waiting made sense. I walked to the barn. A pause. He wasn't in the barn. The cattle were there. They were crowded into the eastern corner, all of them together, just standing, pressed against each other. Alive. Another pause. Halvard wasn't anywhere I could find. She lifted her eyes to Dorothea's. He's gone. I know he's gone. 3 hours in that wind and that cold, at his age. She stopped. Started again. I know he's gone. I just couldn't stay alone in that house. I couldn't stay there waiting for a man I already knew wasn't coming back. Callum stood up from his place across the stove. He crossed the small space and sat down beside Astrid. He reached out and held her arm just above the wrist where her hands were still in the warming water. He didn't say anything. He just held on. Dorothea watched this for a moment. Then she checked the temperature of the water in the cook pot, added a little more from the pot she had heating on the stove, and kept working. They found Halvard Bjork 2 days later. The storm ended on Christmas morning, leaving a world so white and so still that the silence felt structural, like something you could press against and feel pushed back. Dorothea dug out through 4 feet of drifted snow, working from the inside of the entrance outward, and emerged into a pale winter light that made everything flat and featureless. The search party from Imperial found him on the 27th. He had made it to within 200 feet of his barn, 200 feet from the cattle he had gone out to check from the building that would have sheltered him from the survival that had been within reach. He had survived 6 Nebraska winters. The 7th had caught him in the dark in the snow in the 200 feet between where he was and where he needed to be. Astrid stayed in the dome for 4 days after the storm ended. Her hands, recovered 3 fingers on her left hand, showed lasting damage, the tips remaining numb in a way the physician in Culbertson would later confirm was permanent, but she kept the fingers, which was not the outcome Dorothea had feared in the first hours. When Astrid finally went back to her own homestead, she went with the particular straightness of a woman who has recalculated what she can carry and decided to carry it anyway. She did not thank Dorothea. She stood outside the dome in the December cold and looked at the structure, the battered exterior, the frost-worn tumbleweeds visible at the surface, the mud seals still intact, the whole impossible thing still standing after 2 days of the worst storm the county had seen in years. Halvard said it might hold, Astrid said. In December, he came to see it and he said it might hold. She was quiet for a moment. I think he was glad he'd given you the hay. She walked east. January arrived the way January arrives in Nebraska, not as a continuation of what came before, but as a different category of thing entirely. The cold that came in January was not cold by degree. It was cold by nature. It was the cold that lived underneath the other cold, the baseline temperature of a world that had been releasing its stored warmth since September and had now released most of what it had. On the 3rd of January, the temperature dropped to 26 below zero. Halvard's thermometer, Dorothea learned later, had frozen at 20 below and refused to register anything colder. She felt the difference in the dome as a change in the quality of the air, heavier somehow, as if the cold itself had mass, as if the atmosphere had thickened with the effort of holding that much absence of warmth. The interior walls contracted slightly. The frozen plant material of the tumbleweeds shrank in the grip of temperatures beyond anything Nebraska had recorded in living memory. Ice formed on the interior surface where breath condensed and froze against the outer layer. The mud seals cracked in 3 places she found in the morning, and she pressed clay into each crack before the cold could establish itself there. The interior temperature held at 24 degrees, cold enough to see her breath from the moment she woke, cold enough that the water bucket froze solid overnight and had to be thawed against the stove each morning before she could use it, cold enough that she and Callum stopped moving around more than necessary, conserving the body heat that was now the dome's primary resource, but not cold enough to kill them. She burned fuel steadily through the first week of January. The hay from Halvard's stores, the twisted grass she had gathered through autumn, the last of the dry cow chips. She burned it with the discipline of a woman counting every hour it represented, every degree it purchased. On the 7th of January, she burned the last of it. She sat for a moment looking at the empty space where the fuel had been stacked. She calculated. She had known this moment was coming, had been watching it approach for 2 weeks, running the numbers each evening against the temperature readings and the dome's heat retention and the long list of variables she could estimate but not control. She sealed the stove. She did not light it again. For 3 days, they lived on body heat alone. She and Callum lay together under every piece of cloth in the dome, the blanket, the grain sack quilts, her coat, his coat, the extra shirts she had kept back precisely for this calculation. She had known from the data the dome had given her across 4 months that the interior could hold livable temperature without fire if the entrance was sealed, and the two of them generated heat together. She had believed this. She had built toward this. But believing and experiencing occupied different territories in the body, and the 3 days without fire had a weight to them that belief could not fully prepare for. 20 degrees inside the dome, 18 at its lowest on the second night when the cold outside reached depths that the county had no recorded precedent for. Frost formed on the blanket's surface. Their water froze in the pot before they could finish drinking it, and she learned to melt small quantities against the warmth of her hands and drink it immediately. Callum did not complain. He understood, without needing it explained, that complaining was a form of expenditure that the situation did not have budget for. He lay against her, and sometimes he talked about nothing in particular, about a horse he had seen in Imperial that summer, about a bird he wanted to identify that had landed on the dome's exterior, and sat there for several minutes as if considering whether to stay. He talked in the way people talk when talking is itself the point, when the sound of a voice in a cold, silent space is a form of warmth. She listened. She responded. She kept her voice level and present. On the morning of the 10th, Rowena Slade appeared at the entrance. She was hauling a sled. On the sled was hay, not the common hay of a poor fuel store, but good hay, the kind kept for horses in hard weather, dense and dry and high in combustible content. Her face was raw from the cold. Her hands wrapped in rags that had frozen stiff during the 3-mile walk could barely manage the knot she tried to untie at the sled's crossbar. "I came to see if you were dead," she said. She pushed past Dorothea, looked at the cold stove, looked at the frost on the walls, looked at Callum buried under the pile of clothing and blankets in the corner. "Lord," she said quietly. She lit the stove herself. She fed it with hay from the sled, working steadily, until the fire caught and held and began to push heat into the dome's cold interior. She filled the cook pot with snow and set it on the stove and waited for it to boil. She poured the hot water into a cup and put the cup in Dorothea's hands. "Drink it." Dorothea drank it. The warmth moved down through her chest and spread outward, and she understood in that moment, with the clarity that comes from the contrast between cold and heat, how close the margin had been. "Another day," Rowena said. "Maybe two." She was looking at Callum now, watching him sit up from the bedding as the dome warmed around him. "I would have found you past helping." "I know. Then why didn't you come to me? I couldn't carry Callum 3 miles in this cold, and I couldn't leave him." Rowena looked at her for a long moment. Then she said with the precision of a woman who chose her words the way she chose her tools, "That is the most stubborn thing I have ever heard, and I have heard a great deal of stubborn." She paused. "I'm not sure if I mean it as a criticism." She stayed through the night. She kept the stove fed from the hay she had hauled, and in the morning she went back to her own homestead and came back with 2 more sled loads, enough for 3 weeks at careful rationing. "If you run out again," she said before she left the second time you come to me, "you don't sit here waiting." She held Dorothea's gaze. "That's not strength. That's pride dressed up as strength. And pride will kill you faster than the cold will." Dorothea nodded. She meant it when she nodded. She would go if it came to that. She hoped it would not come to that. The morning of January 12th was warm. Not warm in any absolute sense. The temperature at dawn was 34 degrees above zero, which in July would have been cause to put on a coat. But in January 1887, after weeks of temperatures that hovered between -10 and -25, felt like something close to a kindness. Callum went outside without his coat to attend to the morning necessities and came back saying the air felt different, softer, like it had forgotten what it was supposed to be doing. Dorothea stood in the entrance of the dome and looked northwest. She had lived in Nebraska for enough years to know what a January thaw meant. It did not mean warmth was coming. It meant warmth was leaving, burning off in a final display before the cold came back with everything it had been saving. She had seen this before. She had heard it described by people who had survived it and by people who hadn't told secondhand by the ones who found them. She began sealing the dome at 1 in the afternoon. She worked with the focused efficiency of someone who has prepared for a specific moment and recognizes it when it arrives. Every gap pressed with twisted grass. Every crack in the mud seals filled and smoothed. The entrance blanket doubled and weighted with every heavy object the dome contained. The stovepipe collar checked and reinforced. She built the fire up to its maximum and let it burn for 2 hours, driving the interior temperature to its highest possible starting point before she would need to seal the pipe collar against the wind. At 2 o'clock, she looked at Callum. "Come inside," she said, "and stay." He came inside. She sealed the entrance. At 2:15, the wind arrived. Not the wind she had known all autumn, the steady working wind of the Nebraska plains, the wind that was simply part of the landscape like the grass in the sky. This was something categorically different. This was the wind that the January thaw had been clearing the way for, the wind that came off the Rockies, carrying everything the altitude had given it, the wind that moved at 60 miles per hour and carried snow so fine it went through gaps that you couldn't see with your eyes. The dome took the first impact and flexed. The willow poles moved against the wire. The wire moved against the tumbleweeds. The whole structure shifted slightly on its foundation, the way a ship shifts when the first wave of a serious sea reaches it, and then steadied. The sound was like nothing she had encountered in 66 years of life that included 3 decades of working in buildings during storms. It was not a howl or a roar. Those words implied something with a shape, something that came and went in waves. This was continuous. This was total. This was the sound of a world that had stopped doing anything except being cold and fast in every direction without pause. Callum pressed against her side. "Will it hold?" She felt the walls. She felt the willow frame transmitting the storm's pressure through the wire and into the packed tumbleweeds. and the tumbleweeds absorbing it, distributing it across 10,000 interlocked stems, converting the force of 60-mile-per-hour wind into a vibration that moved through the wall and arrived at her palm as almost nothing. "It'll hold," she said. The temperature began to drop. She watched it in the way she had learned to watch it, not on a thermometer. She had no thermometer, but in the behavior of her own body, and Callum's in the quality of the air, in the rate at which the moisture from their breath condensed and froze on the interior wall surface. From 40 degrees to 35 in the first hour. From 35 to 28 in the second. From 28 when the fire went out and she sealed the pipe collar completely to 22 by nightfall. Outside, the temperature was dropping 40 degrees in 4 hours. She knew the numbers later when Rowena told her, when the land office in Imperial recorded it, when the newspapers in Omaha ran the story of what January 12, 1887 had done to the people of Chase County, Nebraska, and the counties around it in the territory stretching north and east across the plains. Inside the dome, she did not know the numbers. She knew 16 degrees. She knew 2 bodies generating heat in a sealed space. She knew 12 inches of compressed dead air between them and the world that was trying to kill them. The storm lasted 2 days and 1 night. The interior temperature reached its lowest point, 16 degrees, at 3 in the morning of the second night, when the cold outside reached depths that the county's records would never exceed again. She and Callum lay pressed together under everything they owned, their breathing slow, and measured their bodies doing the ancient and unglamorous work of staying alive. She was 66 years old. She had 43 cents and a homestead claim and walls made of what everyone had agreed was worthless. The walls held. On the morning of January 13th, the wind stopped. It did not diminish gradually. It stopped between one moment and the next. The freight train sound of 2 days simply ceased. And what replaced it was a silence so complete it had texture, like a substance you could feel against your skin. Dorothea lay still for a moment, listening to the silence. Then she got up. She dug out through 4 feet of drifted snow, working the packed wall of white inward from the entrance building, a small tunnel, and then a larger opening, until she could push through into the outside air. The sky was pale. The light was the thin directional light of a January morning that has spent all its warmth elsewhere. The thermometer at the Bjork farm, Rowena would tell her later, read 4 degrees below zero warmth by the standard of the past 2 days. She stood in the snow outside the dome. Behind her, the dome rose against the pale sky, battered by 2 days of assault. The exterior surface roughed and wind-scoured frost thick on every surface. But the structure was intact. The willow frame had held. The wire had held. The 12 inches of compressed tumbleweeds had held. Callum came through the entrance behind her. He stood beside her in the snow, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and they both looked at the dome for a moment in the pale January light. Rowena arrived 2 hours later, hauling her sled through snow that came to her knees in the shallow places and her waist in the drifts. She stopped in front of the dome and looked at it. Then she looked at Dorothea. "Halvard's wife is all right," she said. "I checked on her first." She set the sled handles down. "The Pendletons lost their youngest. The roof of their soddy caved under the snow load in the night, and they couldn't keep the heat in. Henderson lost 2 children. The Muller grandmother, she was quiet for a moment, going through the accounting. 11 dead across the county. That I know of so far. More probably on claims that nobody's reached yet." She looked at the dome. "Halvard," she said, "found in the snow 200 feet from his own barn." Another pause. "Man survived 6 Nebraska winters." She looked at Dorothea. "And you, in a house made of weeds." Neither of them said anything. The wind was gone. The sky was pale and clear and offered no opinion about any of it. The tumbleweed dome stood in the January morning, frost-covered and battered and entirely intact, while 11 people who had lived in proper houses with timber walls and sod roofs and decades of Nebraska experience had not survived the night. Dorothea breathed out. A white plume rose and dispersed into the frozen air. She heard Halvard's voice as clearly as the morning he had said it outside the ruins of the Hendricks claim in the August sun that made Nebraska's winter feel like someone else's problem. "You'll freeze, and that boy will freeze with you." She looked at the dome. She looked at Callum standing beside her in the snow with his hand in hers. She breathed again. They were still here. Silas Pruitt filed his legal challenge in February. He argued that a structure of tumbleweed and wire did not constitute the substantial improvement required by the Homestead Act to establish legitimate claim to a quarter section of Nebraska territory. He brought two men from Culbertson to testify to this. He brought the county assessor who had opinions about conventional versus unconventional construction. The land office sent an inspector. The inspector arrived on a morning in late February when the temperature had climbed back to 20 degrees above zero, and the county was beginning the slow work of accounting for what the blizzard had taken and what it had left. He walked around the exterior of the dome. He went inside. He pressed his palm against the interior wall and held it there for a long moment. He asked Dorothea several questions about the construction method, which she answered plainly and in full, drawing diagrams in the snow with a stick when words weren't sufficient. He looked at the homestead claim with Rowena Slade's name on the guarantor line. He looked at the dome, which had stood through the worst blizzard in Chase County's recorded history, while 11 people with conventional shelter had not. He wrote in his report in the careful language of a man who understood that what he was describing did not fit neatly into existing categories. Unconventional but substantial improvement. Pruitt's challenge failed. He sold his land holdings in Chase County that spring and moved west. Nobody knew exactly where. The territory was large, and men who needed to become someone different from who they had been had options in 1887 that they would not always have. Nobody in Imperial asked after him. By March, they came to see the dome. First 3 families, then 7, then more than she could easily count homesteaders from across the county and from claims in neighboring counties. People who had heard the story through the particular telegraph of rural communities, which moved slowly but moved everything eventually. They walked through the entrance and stood in the interior and pressed their palms against the packed walls and said the same thing, every one of them, in voices that ranged from wonder to professional assessment to the particular tone of someone revising a position they had held for a long time. It's warm. Dorothea showed them how it was built. She drew diagrams in the dirt of the floor. She explained the principle dead air thermal mass, the specific behavior of compressed material versus loose material, the importance of the excavated floor that put the living space in contact with the Earth's stable temperature. She did not charge for any of it. She had not built this to sell. She had built it to survive, and having survived, the information belonged to anyone who needed it. Rowena Slade banked tumbleweeds against the north wall of her soddy that spring, renewing them each autumn. Her fuel consumption dropped by a third. Her chickens, housed in a small, tumbleweed-insulated coop she built from Dorothea's diagrams, survived the following winter without losses. "I still think it looks ridiculous," Rowena said, standing outside her reinforced soddy on a March afternoon when the first real warmth of spring was beginning to make itself felt in the midday light. A wall made of pest plants, a fire hazard dressed up as architecture. "But it works," Dorothea said. "But it works," Rowena agreed. Astrid Bjork stayed close through that spring. She helped Dorothea extend the kitchen garden, real extension this time, planned and bordered and seeded with the particular care of 2 women who had both learned that the distance between a garden and starvation was shorter than most people thought. She moved back to the Bjork homestead in April, but she returned, often arriving with food or labor or simply company, which turned out to be its own category of resource. Her 3 fingers never fully recovered. She moved them carefully, adapting her grip to what was available. She did not complain about them. Callum grew 1.5 inches that spring. He was 9 years old, and he had spent a winter learning things that most people spent their entire lives not needing to know. He did not seem damaged by it. He seemed clarified, as if the winter had burned away everything that wasn't essential and left what was, which turned out to be considerable. Dorothea Wren proved up her homestead claim in 1889. The land office clerk noted the improvement as unconventional but substantial, which was the same language the inspector had used and which had by then become a kind of shorthand in Chase County for something that shouldn't have worked and did. She kept the dome standing behind the small frame house she eventually built on the quarter section. She used it for storage. She used it occasionally for the visitors who still came years later wanting to see the thing they had heard about, the tumbleweed dome that had stood through the blizzard of 1887, while 11 people with proper houses had not. She pointed to the walls. She explained the principle. She answered every question anyone asked. She died on that quarter section at the age of 83 in the spring of 1903, in the frame house that smelled of cottonwood lumber and years of good cooking, and the particular quality of air that gathers in places where people have lived carefully and fully. Callum was with her. He was 25 years old and teaching at a school in Omaha, and he had come back for the winter and then found himself unable to leave until spring, which was when she died in her own bed, in her own house on the land she had claimed with 43 cents, in a pile of weeds, and the stubborn patient understanding that the most worthless thing in a landscape could become the most valuable if you knew what you were looking at. He buried her in the Imperial Cemetery next to Elias, who had preceded her by 11 years. The minister who spoke at the funeral was a young man who had not known her in her prime, had not known her in the winter of 1887, had not seen what she had built, or how she had built it, or what it had cost her and what it had preserved. But he had heard the story, the way everyone in Chase County had heard the story, and he spoke about it in the careful way of someone handling something they understand they have not fully earned the right to. She built something from nothing, he said, and when nothing was all she had, that was enough. The morning of January 13th, 1887, Dorothea Wren stood in the snow outside the dome she had built from tumbleweed and chicken wire. The storm was over. The sky was pale and cold and offered no commentary on what had happened or who had survived it. Callum stood beside her, his hand in hers. She was 66 years old. She had 43 cents in a cloth purse, a homestead claim with her name on it, and a dome made of what everyone had agreed was the most worthless plant on the Nebraska plains. She breathed out. The white plume rose and vanished into the January air. She heard Halvar Bjork's voice, calm and certain on an August morning that felt like someone else's life. You'll freeze, and that boy will freeze with you. She looked at the dome. She looked at Callum. She breathed again. The air inside 12 inches of compressed dead air had not moved. It had held still, and in its stillness, it had held everything that mattered, the warmth of two bodies. The work of 4 months, the stubbornness of 66 years that had learned the difference between what people said was impossible and what actually was. They were still here. The wind had stopped. The sky was clear. And somewhere in the silence of that January morning, in a dome built from weeds and wire, and the refusal of one 66-year-old woman to accept the verdict of people who had decided she was already finished, the most worthless thing on the Nebraska plains had answered every doubt with the only argument that had ever in the long history of human survival actually mattered. It worked. Ad built the best thing she could build from what she had. Now she would find out if it was enough.